Hello, my name's Jonathan Clifton. I'm an associate professor at the Université Polytechnique, Hauts-de-France in France. I'm also an associate editor of the International Journal of Business Communication. And my friend and colleague, Professor Geert Jacobs from Ghent University, asked me if I'd like to do a quick presentation for the members of ABC. So here I am doing a quick presentation for the members of ABC. So the question I'll be addressing throughout this presentation is best practice really best practice? And just to give you an overview of how I'll be dealing with this, first of all, we'll look at the situation. What do I consider best practice to be? Second, we'll look at some of the problems areas, as I see it, of best practice as currently perceived. Notably, I'll be focusing on the fact that, in my opinion, a lot of what we consider best practice to be is not based on naturally occurring language. Then we'll be looking at a solution to this, which, as I'll outline, is the fact that maybe we should base our knowledge of best practice on what actually happens in naturally occurring talk. And finally, I'll bring it all together in some kind of conclusion. Situation. So, what do we mean by best practice? And for me, I think we can call best practice normative models concerning interaction. And I stress here normative. They're models that are telling people what they should and should not be doing in interactional situations. And this is the kind of thing that I think you can find in professional text, training manuals, seminars. The web is full of it, from consultants, and the kind of thing that you can find in how-to books. So let's look at a couple of examples. So first of all, we have the kind of general advice. And here we've got an example from job interviews. And the advice is never criticize anybody. So it's advice that you intuitively feels correct, that it's a mistake to criticize people, especially former colleagues, former boss, in a job interview. But we'll come back to this one a little bit later. Is that really good advice? So another example of fairly general advice, this one comes from appraisal interviews. And the advice is create rapport. So for a manager, giving an appraisal interview or having an appraisal interview with his or her subordinates, create rapport. Intuitively we think, yes, obvious. But the question would be, how do we create rapport? Is there anything in this kind of advice that helps you? We have a kind of intuitive knowledge of what this might mean, but how do we really create rapport in general, or more specifically in an appraisal interview? Then moving on, we have advice that is a little bit more specific. This one again comes from appraisal interviews, and it gives advice on dealing with irrelevant topics. So the tactic here is dismiss and redirect, so we're getting a little bit more detail on what to do here. And we even have a couple of phrases, a couple of sentences, an example of how you could possibly do this. So we're getting much more into some kind of presentation of what to actually say. And we move on to completely imagined dialogues. So this one is an example taken from a book on cross-cultural communication, and it's designed to showcase Edward Hall's notion of high context communication and low context communication. In other words, the idea that some cultures have a very direct style of communicating and other cultures are more indirect, and you have to really understand the context before you can get the meaning. But the point here is the dialogue is completely imagined, and it goes from the theory to the dialogue. Problem. So let me make some observations about best practice as I've just laid it out. So first of all, maybe it's imprecise. So some of the advice, such as create rapport, fine. I don't think anybody would disagree with that, but how do we create rapport in an appraisal interview, for example? Some of it's fairly intuitive. Again, and I'll come back to this point later, at a job interview, never criticize your previous employee or boss. Intuitively, it's correct, but is it really? And again, we'll look at that in a little bit more detail later on. It's imagined. The last dialogue we looked at there, completely imagined. And it's ideological, or should I say theory-driven. It's designed to show a particular theory. So we're moving from the theory to an example. And what I'm going to be arguing is maybe it's better to do that the other way around, to move from naturally occurring talk to best practice rather than the other way around. And finally, a lot of the advice we've been looking at totally ignores the context. It presents the advice as if it's universally applied, and it's decontextualized. So perhaps if we can sum up what I see as a problem with the current state of best practice, is we're moving from norms, what people should be doing, to language. So what happens if we actually look at naturally occurring interaction? And what I'm going to present over the next few minutes comes from an article that I wrote with Dorien van der Meerop and Charlotte Scheurs, which was published in the International Journal of Business Communication in 2019. And it's an analysis of naturally occurring job interviews. I should point out that this data is translated from the original Dutch, and it was recorded in about 2015. And this is just one example from a much larger corpus of job interviews that we collected. So I should first point out that this interview concerns a candidate who comes from an IT background, going for an IT job. And in response to a question from the interviewer, he begins to talk about tool independence. So he says that tool independence is for me not a problem. And then he goes on to say that he works more with Microsoft. So it's very much here a case of institutional interaction. So we have a question from the interviewer, a response from the candidate. So it's very asymmetrical in terms of turn taking, who has access to which turns. It's the interviewer who has access to the questions, the candidate who answers. And we have very much a professional identity that is being created. Tool dependence, he's talking about his professional identity. But then at the end, he makes this metaphor, and he says that if you can cycle, then it actually doesn't matter on which bike. And what we're going to look at is the way that from this metaphor, there's a transition in the job interview, and we move to small talk, in fact. So we move away from institutional interaction into something that's much more symmetrical. So in this slide, we can see how the dialogue, the job interview, moves from institutional interaction in which the interviewer is asking questions to a much more kind of personalized interaction, much more symmetrical, with the candidate also asking questions. So first we see that from this metaphor of cycling, the recruiter begins to talk about an accident that happened at a big intersection in Courtrai. And then the candidate says, well, it wasn't me who caused the accident. And this causes the recruiter to laugh. So what we have here is a joke leading to laughter, which leads to affiliation. The candidates are beginning to affiliate with each other, to move out of the strict question and answer institutional interaction. And what we see here is they then move into small talk, which allows them to build a relationship. So we have the recruiter asking, are you from around here? And the candidate then begins some personal disclosure and talks about his childhood in Haarlem. And what's interesting here is the recruiter reciprocates and begins to talk about the mother So we've got personal disclosure happening here. And in terms of identity, both the candidate and the recruiter are putting their local identities in play. They're establishing that they're locals. And through this, a kind of co-membership is established. In other words, they're displaying that they're the same kind of people, they've got the same kind of background. And this co-membership is very important. And various researchers, and here you'll find the references in the final slide, Karekas and Libowski, they both talk about the importance of establishing co-membership, similarity between the interviewer and the interviewee if you want to have a successful job interview. And what I argue is it's this small talk that allows this to happen. So here we'll see how the dialogue moves to something that is much more akin to small talk, away from institutional interaction, where rapport is established. And this allows the candidate to establish a different kind of identity, moving away from a professional identity to very much a personal identity rather than a professional identity. So here we can see, as part of this move away from institutional interaction, then in fact here we actually have the candidate who asks the questions, but do you know, rather than the recruiter. And not only does the candidate ask the questions, but we can also see that the candidate assesses the answers. So we have this move away from institutional interaction to a much more symmetrical form of interaction, where who asks the questions, who assesses the answers of the questions can change. We noticed also that there's a change in the register. So, for example, the candidate says, no, the sister of the Jeff. The Jeff in Flemish is a colloquial expression. So we've got a change of register here, away from a formal, professional kind of register to a much more colloquial, familiar form. And this is reciprocated by the recruiter, who also talks about the Jeff. So there's a movement towards affiliation, building relationship, building rapport between the candidate and the recruiter. And from this position, this is where it begins to get interesting, because we move to a situation where the candidate actually criticizes his current boss. So going back to what we looked at earlier, a lot of the best practice says, never criticize. And intuitively you think, yeah, fine, that's good. Don't criticize your previous boss. If you do so, you're not going to get the job. But here we see he criticizes his previous boss, and he still gets the job. So first we notice this criticism is fairly hedged, but I think the vision of Glendever is the boss, doesn't really match a lot with mine. So it's fairly hedged, initially at least. But what we see is, from this fairly hedged criticism, the recruiter aligns. I can imagine something regarding that. So we've got this alignment building up. They're sharing the same opinion here. And we can see this is built up a little bit more. It goes slowly, and this is... And then the recruiter says, yeah, it's always a bit heavier. So the criticism becomes more explicit. And again, we've got the recruiter aligning with this. And in the end, we move to more direct criticism. So the candidate says, yes, 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 yes. And this is actually pronounced very, very slowly, which mimics the slowness of the boss. And then it shows some kind of reference to the unnecessary administration. We'll put it on paper, we'll describe it to perfection, and then we'll read it. So in the end here, we get to explicit criticism of the boss. But if I can pull that together now into several observations. I mean, firstly, what we've seen here is the way the interaction becomes much more symmetrical, with the candidate actually asking questions. The topic shifts away from a purely professional identity to talk about family and friends, mutual family and friends, and we move into a kind of small talk frame. Now, I think that small talk frame is really recognized. In the how-to books, it's Job interviews are perceived as institutional interaction, and advice is given about how to talk in such a situation. But the fact that it often, from the corpus we looked at anyway, that there are often elements of small talk in there, totally ignored in the best practice books. So maybe job interviews are much more hybrid. There is some more formal institutional interaction, but there's also small talk as well. And maybe candidates should be aware of this and how to exploit it. Because what I think we've looked at is how you move out of institutional interaction can lead to the creation of a much more personalized identity, showing yourself to be much more human. And also, significantly, going back to what we looked at the beginning of the presentation, the advice that's given in the how-to books is don't criticize, don't gossip in a way. But what I'll argue here is that through gossiping about the previous boss that they don't know, in this particular situation, we're creating trust. So if we look at Burton Knez, 1996, they say when you exchange sensitive information with someone, trust is implicit in the risk you now face that the other person might leak this information. So in criticizing the boss, the candidate is building up this trustworthy person. I trust you as the recruiter, and you trust me because we're beginning to reveal secrets, if you like. So it leads to a much more, the possibility to create a much more trustworthy identity and a much more personalized identity. And as I said, the person in this job interview, they got offered the job, so for him it worked. Yet it flies in the face of a lot of the advice about how to carry out job interviews. So, having discussed some of the potential problems with our current understanding of best practice, for us as business communication instructors, is there a solution? So, is there a solution? And perhaps one way of finding a solution to this problem is, as Eric Adarik says, to move away from communication training and skills development and to shift focus to looking at language awareness. In other words, getting the students or clients to look at naturally occurring language and giving them the tools to analyze that language so that they can then make their own decisions. So what Erica is basically arguing for is that instead of moving from norms to language, what we should be doing, if we move on to the next slide, is moving from the language itself, from naturally occurring language, from how language is used in situation by real people going about real workplace activities, to move from that to developing an awareness of language, how language is used, a contextually bound awareness. In order to do this, of course, what we'd need to do as instructors is to teach our students and clients some linguistic theory and looking at things like conversation analysis, rhetoric, sociolinguistics, blindness theory, metaphor, and so on. Teaching these linguistic tools and then asking students, clients to look at what actually happens in the workplace around them and use these tools in which to analyze what is going on. And I just want to make one recommendation. As a book that came out in 2017, written by Erica Darrix and Veronica Koller, Language in Business, Language at Work. And I just picked this out as one example that shows this kind of approach and how it can work. So I recommend having a look at this book to see how the kind of approach that I'm putting forward can be enacted. In conclusion then, what can we say? So, is best practice best? Well, maybe, and as I say, I don't really want to throw out the baby with the bathwater. There's possibly a lot of positive stuff there as well. And here I'm quoting from Cameron, It's Good to Talk. Again, an excellent book, and I highly recommend it if you're more interested in the theme that I'm developing today. But Cameron calls the best practice that we have at the moment a depressing phenomenon. And she says it's reductive, which I think it probably is, sometimes plainly misguided. Again, if we look at what I've looked at during this presentation, the advice was don't criticize your former employees during a job interview. Yet we see that sometimes that's not quite the case. So misguided, maybe. And then Cameron goes on to say that the talk people produce without any expert help is immensely richer and more complex and more varied than anything appearing in the advice text that I've surveyed. So maybe that's a call saying, well, okay, let's look at what really happens and base our advice on what really happens. And she goes on, and I want to conclude with this quote by Cameron, who says that this approach, in other words, working from norms to advice, does not produce better communication, nor does it produce more skilled and empowered communicators. It cannot produce those things because it negates the single most important ability of a truly skilled communicator, the ability to assess what is going on in a situation and choose strategies that are likely to be effective in that situation. So, to conclude, what I'd argue that maybe working from naturally occurring talk and giving students, clients, the skills to analyze that talk is maybe the way to get to a truly skilled communicator. And on that point, I'll end. So thank you very much for your attention. For those of you who have managed to make it through to the end, obviously normally in a traditional conference setting, there'd be space for questions, but I'm leaving my email address there. So if any of you want to come back with questions, comments, criticisms, feel free to go ahead and contact me. Once again, thank you very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you found what I had to say informative. On the final slide, the last slide, you'll see a list of references, the books and articles that I've referred to during this presentation. Thank you very much for listening, and goodbye. And of course, in the current times, stay safe. Bye-bye. References 1 and the second page of references.